They had no idea the man they were about to turn away owned more than everyone in the room combined. In less than 5 minutes, this quiet birthday dinner would turn into the biggest mistake that restaurant had ever made. 3 minutes from now, every person in that dining room would wish they had treated him differently, but by then, it would already be too late. Ethan Walker stood just inside the entrance of the upscale downtown restaurant, the soft glow of warm lights reflecting off polished marble floors, the faint sound of glasses clinking and low laughter filling the air, and for a brief moment he allowed himself to take it all in, not as a CEO, not as a millionaire, but simply as a man hoping for a quiet birthday dinner, something simple, something normal, something he hadn't allowed himself in years, dressed in a plain navy jacket, dark jeans, and worn leather shoes, intentionally understated, intentionally invisible, because tonight he didn't want recognition. He wanted peace, but the hostess barely glanced at his face before her eyes dropped to his clothes, her polite smile tightening just enough to reveal her judgment. And with a quick scan of her tablet, she said they were fully booked, even though half the tables behind her sat empty. Reserve signs neatly placed but untouched. Ethan nodded slowly, not arguing, not revealing, just absorbing, because this wasn't new to him, this experiment, this quiet test of how people treated someone who didn't look like money. And just as he turned slightly, considering whether to leave or insist, a burst of laughter from a nearby table cut through the moment, followed by a dismissive glance from another staff member who clearly agreed with the hostess's silent conclusion. And still, Ethan said nothing, because part of him wanted to see how far this would go, how far perception could override reality, how quickly respect could disappear without the right watch, the right suit, the right signal of status. And just a few feet away, seated at a small corner table near the window, Sophie Bennett gently slid a plate toward her young son, her fingers lingering for a second, as if making sure he had enough before she took anything for herself, her eyes tired but kind, her posture carrying the quiet weight of someone used to putting others first. And she had seen everything, every glance, every subtle shift in tone, every unspoken judgment. And there was something about the way Ethan stood there, calm, composed, yet unmistakably alone, that didn't sit right with her, because she knew that look, the look of someone being underestimated, the look of someone dismissed before being understood. And as the hostess began to turn away, ready to move on to the next guest who looked more appropriate, Sophie made a decision that would change everything. Not because she had power, not because she had money, but because she refused to stay silent. And in that moment, without knowing who Ethan Walker really was, she chose to see him differently than everyone else in that room. Sophie Bennett did not raise her voice. She did not make a scene. But there was something steady and unshakable in the way she stood up from her chair, gently placing a hand on the back of her son's seat as she stepped forward, her eyes fixed not on the hostess, but on Ethan, as if she had already decided he deserved more than what he was being given. And for a brief second, the entire rhythm of the room seemed to slow, conversations fading into the background as she spoke with quiet clarity, saying that he could take her table, that she and her son could leave, that it was not a big deal. But the way she said it made it very clear that it was, because it was never just about a table, it was about dignity. And the hostess blinked, caught off guard, clearly not expecting anyone to interrupt the smooth, unspoken hierarchy she had already established. And she quickly responded that it would not be necessary, her tone tightening again. But Sophie did not sit back down. She did not retreat. Instead, she added that she had seen empty tables, that she understood reservations, but she also understood fairness, and that this man had been standing there longer than some of the people currently being seated. And now a few nearby diners began to notice, their attention shifting, subtle glances exchanged, the invisible line between observer and participant starting to blur. And Ethan remained still, watching, not stepping in, not correcting, not revealing, because something about this moment mattered more than the meal itself. It was raw, unfiltered, unscripted, and for the first time that evening, the power in the room shifted slightly, not because of money, not because of status, but because someone chose to speak, and the manager, alerted by the growing tension, approached with a practiced smile that carried just enough authority to restore order, asking what the issue was, and before the hostess could answer, Sophie calmly explained, not exaggerating, not accusing, simply stating what she had witnessed. And there was a subtle difference in how the manager listened, his expression, changing not from empathy, but from calculation, scanning Ethan again, this time more carefully, as if reconsidering something he might have missed, and Ethan met his gaze briefly, offering nothing, no hint of frustration, no demand for recognition, just quiet patience, which somehow made the situation even more uncomfortable, because it removed the excuse of conflict, and the manager hesitated, caught between maintaining appearances and correcting a mistake that was becoming increasingly visible. And just a few feet away, Sophie's son looked up at his mother, confused but trusting, unaware that the small act he had just witnessed was about to ripple far beyond their table. And as the seconds stretched, the weight of the moment grew heavier, because now it was no longer just about whether Ethan would be seated. It was about what kind of place this restaurant truly was, and whether the people running it were willing to admit that they had judged too quickly. And for the first time since Ethan walked in, the room was no longer ignoring him. It was watching him, waiting to see what would happen next. The manager cleared his throat softly, adjusting his jacket as if buying himself a few extra seconds to think, and then he offered a carefully measured response, saying there must have been a misunderstanding, that they were simply managing reservations, that the evening had been unexpectedly busy. But even as he spoke, his eyes flickered again toward Ethan, this time not with dismissal, but with curiosity, as if something about the man's calm presence did not match the assumption that had been made just minutes earlier. And Ethan remained composed, his hands relaxed at his sides, his expression neutral, giving no indication that he needed to be defended, which only made Sophie's decision to step forward feel even more deliberate, because she was not reacting to anger, she was responding to quiet injustice. And the manager finally gestured toward the dining area, offering to see what could be done, a phrase that sounded helpful but carried no real commitment. And before he could turn away, Sophie spoke again, her voice still calm but firmer now, asking a simple question that hung in the air longer than anyone expected. Why was it that some guests without reservations were being seated while he was not? And this time there was no easy answer, because several nearby diners had clearly arrived after Ethan, their coats still draped over their arms, their menus freshly opened, and the inconsistency was no longer subtle. It was visible, undeniable, and the manager's expression tightened just slightly, the kind of shift that only happens when control begins to slip. And for a brief moment, the polished atmosphere of the restaurant cracked, revealing something less refined underneath, something human, flawed, and uncomfortable. And Ethan exhaled quietly, almost imperceptibly, not out of frustration, but out of recognition, because he had seen this before in different forms, in boardrooms, in meetings, in places where people made quick decisions based on incomplete information, and he had learned long ago that the most revealing moments were not when people were performing at their best, but when they were forced to confront their own assumptions. And as the silence stretched, the manager made a decision, one that felt less like generosity and more like damage control, offering Ethan a table that had suddenly become available, his tone shifting into something more respectful, more careful, as if trying to rewrite the last few minutes without actually acknowledging them. But before Ethan could respond, Sophie glanced back at her son, then at her half-finished meal, and without hesitation, she reached for her bag, preparing to give up her seat anyway, because for her, the outcome had already been decided. It was not about convenience. It was about doing what felt right, and that quiet certainty carried more weight than any apology could. And it was in that exact moment, as the manager watched, as the staff hesitated, as the room held its breath, that something changed in the way Ethan looked at Sophie, not with surprise, but with recognition, as if her action had just confirmed something he had been searching for all along, something far more valuable than a reservation. And the story that everyone thought was about a table was beginning to reveal itself as something much bigger, Ethan reached out gently, not to stop Sophie, but to pause the moment before it slipped away, his voice calm and steady as he said she did not need to give up her table, that she had already done more than enough. And for a second, Sophie hesitated, her hand still resting on the strap of her worn handbag, unsure whether to insist or accept, because she was not used to being seen in moments like this, not used to having her small acts acknowledged. And the manager quickly stepped in again, sensing the delicate shift, offering to seat both of them, suggesting they could arrange something, his tone now noticeably different, more accommodating, more eager, as if trying to restore balance before the situation defined the entire evening. And Ethan glanced at the dining room once more, at the guests who were now openly watching, at the staff who had grown unusually attentive, and then back at Sophie, who was still standing beside her table, her son looking between them with quiet curiosity. And in that instant, Ethan made a decision that had nothing to do with status or pride. He simply asked if they would join him instead, not as a favor, not as repayment, but as an invitation, something genuine, something human. And Sophie blinked, surprised, instinctively shaking her head at first, explaining that it was his birthday, that he should enjoy his evening the way he planned, but Ethan smiled slightly, the first real hint of warmth breaking through his composed exterior, and said that this was exactly how he wanted to spend it, with people who reminded him what actually mattered. And there was a sincerity in his voice that made it difficult to refuse, not because of who he was, but because of how he said it. And after a brief pause, Sophie agreed, slowly sitting back down as the manager hurried to rearrange the setting, pulling an extra chair, signaling to the staff with a level of urgency that had not been there before. And within moments, the same restaurant that had denied Ethan a seat was now adjusting itself around him, trying to anticipate every need, every detail, as if service alone could erase what had already happened. But Ethan did not react to the sudden shift. He did not acknowledge the change in tone, because his attention had already moved elsewhere towards Sophie and her son, asking simple questions: where they were from, how old her son was, what they liked to eat, and the conversation unfolded naturally, without tension, without pretense. And for the first time since he walked in, Ethan was not being evaluated, and Sophie was not being overlooked. They were simply two people sharing a table. And yet, just beneath the surface, something else was building, something the manager had begun to sense but could not fully place, because there was still a missing piece, something about Ethan that did not quite fit the narrative they had assigned to him. And as the staff moved more carefully, as whispers quietly passed between them, one of the servers leaned toward the manager, speaking just low enough to avoid drawing attention, mentioning that the name sounded familiar, that there might have been a reservation earlier under a different arrangement. And the manager's expression shifted again, this time not from uncertainty, but from realization slowly taking shape. And as he looked back toward Ethan, who was now laughing softly at something Sophie's son had said, the weight of what might be unfolding began to settle in. Because if he was right, then the mistake they had made was far bigger than anyone at that table had yet realized. The manager felt a quiet pressure building in his chest as the pieces began to connect: the name, the timing, the reservation that had been flagged earlier that day under a private note. And without drawing attention, he stepped away toward the host stand, pulling up the system with slightly unsteady hands, scrolling through the reservations until he found it. A booking under a discreet corporate account tied to a name he now recognized instantly: Ethan Walker, with special instructions marked confidential. And for a brief moment, everything around him seemed to fade, because the realization hit all at once. They had not just misjudged a guest, they had turned away the very person whose company partially funded the building they were standing in. And the first wave of panic rose quickly, sharp and undeniable. But he forced himself to stay composed, glancing back toward the table where Ethan sat laughing softly with Sophie and her son, completely unaware, or perhaps completely aware, and choosing not to react. And that uncertainty only made it worse, because if this had been intentional, if Ethan had chosen to come in like this, then this was no longer a simple mistake. It was a test they had already failed. And before he could decide how to respond, the first escalation hit: a sharply dressed man near the center of the dining room, who had been waiting for his own table, stood up and approached the host stand, his voice low but firm, saying he had just recognized Ethan Walker, that he had seen him at a business conference just months ago, and now the whisper began to spread, quiet at first, then gaining momentum, table to table, guest to guest, until the energy of the room shifted again, this time charged with realization, curiosity, and a hint of disbelief, because the man they had all overlooked was not just wealthy, he was influential, respected, someone whose name carried weight far beyond this restaurant, and the staff felt it immediately, the subtle change in how guests were now looking at them, not with admiration, but with expectation, waiting to see how they would handle what had already gone wrong. And the manager returned to the table, his posture straighter, his tone more careful than ever, beginning to apologize, not in the vague, polished way from before, but with a level of urgency that revealed the truth he had just uncovered. But before he could finish, the second escalation unfolded in a way no one expected. Sophie's son, innocent and unaware of the tension, looked up at Ethan and asked a simple question, asking why everyone was suddenly staring at him. And the table fell quiet for a split second, because there was no easy answer that would preserve the illusion, and Ethan paused, then smiled gently, saying sometimes people only notice others when they think they should, not when they actually should have, and that quiet response carried more weight than any formal apology, because it exposed the entire situation without calling anyone out directly, and the manager stood. They are caught between speaking and listening, realizing that whatever he said next would not erase what had already been revealed, not just about the restaurant, but about how easily people could be misjudged. And as the room settled into this new awareness, one thing became undeniable. The power in the situation had completely shifted, and it no longer belonged to the people who thought they controlled it. The manager's apology lingered in the air, but it no longer carried the authority it once might have, because the moment had already moved beyond words, and Ethan did not respond right away. Instead, he simply nodded once, acknowledging what was said without giving it weight, then turned his attention back to Sophie's son, asking him what his favorite subject in school was, as if nothing else in the room mattered. And that choice, that quiet refusal to engage with the sudden shift in treatment, created a deeper kind of tension, because it forced everyone watching to sit with what had already happened, rather than escape it through formalities. And Sophie noticed it too. The way Ethan did not lean into the recognition, did not correct anyone, did not take advantage of the power that had just returned to him, and it made her study him more carefully, trying to understand why someone in his position would choose silence over control. And across the room, the staff moved with heightened precision, refilling glasses that were already full, adjusting place settings that did not need adjusting, their actions no longer driven by routine, but by a quiet urgency to compensate. And yet the more they tried, the more obvious it became that something genuine had already been missed, something that could not be fixed with perfect service, and the manager remained nearby, unsure whether to stay or step away, caught between wanting to make things right and realizing that the opportunity to do so had already passed. And then Ethan finally spoke again, not to the manager, but to Sophie, asking how long she had been raising her son on her own, and the question was simple, but shifted the focus entirely, grounding the moment in something real, something human. And Sophie answered honestly, explaining that it had been several years, that it was not always easy, but that she had learned to keep going no matter what. And Ethan listened without interruption, without offering solutions, just listening, which in itself felt rare. And as their conversation unfolded, the contrast between them became clearer, not in status, but in experience, both of them having navigated different kinds of challenges, both of them understanding what it meant to be underestimated in different ways. And at a nearby table, the man who had recognized Ethan earlier continued watching, now with a different expression, one that held a quiet respect, not for the wealth he represented, but for the way he carried it. And slowly, the energy in the room began to settle again, not back to what it was before, but into something more reflective, more aware, as if the entire space had been forced to reconsider its assumptions. And the manager, realizing that no grand gesture would undo what had happened, made a quieter decision, instructing the staff to treat every guest with the same level of attention. Not just this table, not just tonight, but moving forward, because the lesson had become impossible to ignore. And at the center of it all, Ethan and Sophie continue their conversation, not as symbols of a situation, but as two people who had crossed paths at exactly the right moment. And while no one said it out loud, everyone in that room understood that what had just happened would not be forgotten, not because of who Ethan Walker was, but because of what Sophie Bennett had chosen to do when it mattered most. The evening continued in a way no one had expected, not with grand gestures or dramatic declarations, but with something far quieter and far more meaningful. As Ethan leaned back slightly in his chair, listening as Sophie spoke about her daily routine, the early mornings, the long hours, the constant balancing act of being both provider and parent, and there was no trace of self-pity in her voice, only a steady resilience that had been built over time. And Ethan found himself asking more questions, not out of curiosity alone, but out of genuine interest, because her story felt grounded in something real, something that could not be measured in numbers or titles. And Sophie, in turn, began to relax, the initial tension fading as she realized that Ethan was not trying to impress her, not trying to position himself above her, but simply meeting her where she was. And her son, now more comfortable, joined in the conversation, talking about school projects and favorite foods, his voice carrying the kind of unfiltered honesty that only children have. And Ethan smiled more easily now, responding with the same openness, creating a space at the table that felt unexpectedly warm, almost as if the earlier discomfort had cleared the way for something more genuine to take its place. And across the room, the staff continued their work with a heightened awareness, but the urgency had softened into something more thoughtful, more intentional, as if they were beginning to understand that service was not just about efficiency, but about attention, about seeing people for who they were rather than what they appeared to be. And the manager, still observing from a distance, noticed the shift not only in the room, but in himself, the realization. Settling in that leadership was not proven in moments of control, but in moments of correction, and that what had happened tonight would shape how he approached every decision moving forward. And as the meal progressed, Ethan paused for a moment, glancing around the restaurant, not with judgment, but with reflection, as if he were taking in the full weight of the experience. And then he reached into his jacket, pulling out a small card, placing it on the table between them, but not sliding it forward, not making a point of it, simply letting it rest there as part of the conversation. And Sophie noticed it, her eyes briefly scanning the name, the title, the company, and for a split second, her expression shifted, not into shock, but into understanding, as the pieces quietly aligned, and she looked back at Ethan, not with awe, not with hesitation, but with the same steady gaze she had held from the beginning. Because in that moment, the information changed nothing about how she saw him, and that, more than anything else that had happened that night, caught Ethan off guard in a way he had not expected, because he was used to the moment when people realized who he was, used to the shift that followed, the subtle change in tone, in posture, in intention, but none of that came. And instead, Sophie simply nodded once, acknowledging the information without letting it define the interaction, and continued the conversation as if nothing had changed. And it was in that quiet, almost invisible choice that the true balance of the evening revealed itself. Because while the room had spent the entire night reacting to Ethan's identity, Sophie had connected with him before it was ever known, and that difference carried a weight that no title ever could. By the time the plates began to clear, the atmosphere in the restaurant had transformed into something quieter, more reflective, as if the entire space had absorbed the lesson unfolding at a single table near the window. And Ethan sat back slightly, watching as Sophie's son carefully finished the last bite of his meal, a small smile forming on the boy's face that spoke more honestly than any words could. And for a moment, Ethan allowed himself to simply exist in that scene, free from expectations, free from titles, just present. And it was a feeling he realized he had been missing for longer than he cared to admit. And Sophie noticed the shift in him, the subtle softening in his expression, and she asked, almost casually, If he ever had nights like this, where things did not go according to plan but somehow turned out better, and Ethan let out a quiet breath, admitting that it was rare, that most of his life was structured, scheduled down to the minute, where outcomes were predicted and controlled, and that tonight had been different in a way he could not have arranged even if he tried. And Sophie nodded, understanding that kind of distance in a different way, explaining that her life was the opposite, unpredictable, constantly shifting, where control was often an illusion, and yet somehow, in that contrast, they had met in the same space, in the same moment, and it created a sense of balance that neither of them had expected. And across the room, the manager approached once more, but this time there was no rehearsed tone, no polished script, just a quiet sincerity as he thanked Sophie for speaking up, acknowledging that her actions had changed more than just the outcome of one evening. And then he turned to Ethan, offering a final apology, not for the sake of formality, but because he understood now what had truly been at stake, and Ethan accepted it with a simple nod, not dismissing it, but not dwelling on it either, because the moment had already moved beyond that point. And as the check arrived, placed discreetly at the edge of the table, Sophie instinctively reached for her purse, but Ethan gently stopped her, not in a way that created obligation, but in a way that felt natural, explaining that it was his birthday and that sharing the evening had been the only gift he needed. And Sophie hesitated for just a second, before accepting, not out of necessity, but out of mutual respect, understanding that this was not about money, it was about meaning. And as they prepared to leave, the room seemed to watch them once again, but differently this time, not with curiosity or judgment, but with a quiet acknowledgement of what had taken place. And as Ethan stood, he looked once more at Sophie and her son, thanking her not for giving up her table, but for choosing to step forward when it would have been easier to stay. Silent, and Sophie gave a small smile, brushing it off in her own way, saying it was just the right thing to do, but both of them understood that it had been more than that, because in a world where people often looked away, she had chosen to look closer, and that choice had changed everything. Not just for Ethan, not just for the restaurant, but for everyone who had witnessed it, whether they realized it or not. As they stepped out of the restaurant and into the cool night air, the noise of the dining room faded behind them, replaced by the quiet hum of the city, distant traffic, soft streetlights casting long reflections across the sidewalk, and for a brief moment, the three of them stood there together without speaking, as if none of them were quite ready to let the night in just yet. And Ethan glanced back once at the restaurant doors, not with resentment, but with a kind of quiet closure, because what had started as a simple plan had turned into something far more meaningful than he could have anticipated, and Sophie adjusted her jacket slightly, her son holding her hand as he looked up at her, and then at Ethan, asking if they would see him again. The question simple and honest, and Ethan smiled, crouching slightly to meet the boy at eye level, telling him that he hoped they would, because meeting them had been the best part of his day. And there was no exaggeration in his voice, no performance, just truth. And as he stood back up, he reached into his pocket once more, this time handing Sophie a different card, not the formal business one from earlier, but something more personal with a direct number written on it, explaining that if she ever needed anything, or even just wanted to talk, she should not hesitate to reach out. And Sophie looked at it for a moment, then back at him. And instead of reacting with surprise or hesitation, she simply nodded, accepting it with the same grounded calm she had shown all evening, because she understood that this was not about charity, it was about connection. And as they began to part ways, Ethan watched as she and her son walked down the street, their figures gradually blending into the rhythm of the city. And there was something about that image that stayed with him, something steady, something real. And in the days that followed, the impact of that night continued to unfold in ways no one at the restaurant could have predicted. The manager implemented new policies focused not on appearances, but on fairness, training his staff to approach every guest with the same level of respect regardless of how they looked, and word of what had happened quietly spread, not as gossip, but as a reminder, a story that people told not because of the mistake, but because of the response to it. And Ethan, back in his world of meetings and decisions, found himself thinking about that evening more often than he expected, not about the moment he was turned away, but about the moment someone chose to stand up, and it influenced the way he approached his own work, the way he evaluated people, the way he listened. And one afternoon, without prior notice, Sophie received a call, not from an assistant, not from a company, but from Ethan himself, asking how she and her son were doing, continuing the conversation as if no time had passed, because for him, it had not been a one-time encounter. It had been a turning point, and as their lives moved forward, connected now by something simple but rare, the lesson of that night remained clear, not spoken, not written, but understood that respect is not something earned by status, but something revealed through action. And sometimes, the smallest decision to step forward can change not just a moment, but the direction of an entire story. In one of the most touching stories, a powerful CEO experiences an unexpected moment of rejection on a night that was supposed to be personal and meaningful, only to discover that true value is not defined by wealth or status, but by human connection. As the evening unfolds inside an upscale restaurant, a single mother quietly observes an unfair situation and makes a simple yet courageous decision that shifts the entire atmosphere, proving how small acts of kindness can create life-changing outcomes in ways no one anticipates. This narrative captures the essence of touching stories by showing how judgment based on appearance can lead to misunderstanding, while genuine empathy can restore dignity in an instant. Through the interaction between a successful businessman seeking simplicity and a resilient single mother raising her child with strength and humility, the story highlights the contrast between perception and reality, reminding viewers that respect should never be conditional. As tension builds and identities are slowly revealed, the emotional journey deepens, making this one of those touching stories that stays with you long after it ends. The restaurant becomes more than just a setting. It becomes a reflection of society, where assumptions are challenged and values are tested, ultimately leading to a powerful shift not only in behavior, but in perspective. This is why touching stories like this resonate so strongly, because they reveal truths about kindness, fairness, and the importance of seeing people for who they truly are rather than what they appear to be. As the connection between the CEO and the single mother grows, the story evolves into something far greater than a simple encounter, becoming one of those rare, touching stories that blend emotional depth with meaningful life lessons. In the end, it is not money or influence that defines the outcome, but a quiet decision to stand up, to acknowledge, and to treat others with dignity, making this one of the most memorable, touching stories that reminds us how powerful a single moment of compassion can be. Character 1, a 39-year-old white American male CEO, wearing simple navy jacket, dark jeans, leather shoes, front-facing portrait, realistic lighting, calm, confident expression, no luxury cues, natural skin texture, no cartoon, no CGI, no illustration. High-resolution cinematic detail. Character 2, a 28-year-old white American single mother, wearing modest casual clothing, soft natural makeup, gentle but strong facial features, slightly tired eyes, front-facing portrait, realistic lighting, natural skin texture, no cartoon, no CGI, no illustration, high-resolution cinematic detail.